We're going to start with our invocation from our very own professor of philosophy at Seattle University, Dr. Jason Worthy. Please welcome.
So I'm going to read a very short statement, and then I'm going to reflect on it for 5 minutes. The statement. We at the Seattle Poetics Lab and their many friends gathered here today acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral lands of the Duwamish people and other Coast Salish peoples. There are people that are still here, continuing to honor and bring to light their ancient heritage. You know, one of the misunderstandings of land acknowledgements is it's kind of a white guilt invention. And I have no doubt there's aspects of that in some of his performances, but it's actually a very ancient practice. And it's the practice of coming to a land and acknowledging that you're on this land. Now the difference is, we showed up on land and settled it. That's the difference. That's what's new, not the land acknowledgement. The fact that our way of showing up on the land is not an ancestral way of being on the land. That means then that these acknowledgements begin the movement towards truth and the movement towards serious dialogue and the opening of our hearts towards that. So I think they're very important. So good morning, everyone. I'm so happy you're here.
Good morning, and I want to welcome you again to the 7th Cascadia Poetry Festival. Who are you? I wasn't expecting to be acknowledged or introduced. I'm just the guy at the mic. A face for radio. I'm David. Friend of the organization. Let's say that. Just a few quick notes here. Excuse me. We want to thank you all for coming out actually and enjoying this definitely again. We had a very excellent time last night. I had a departure a little bit early, but it sounds like it went very well. And so, just a few reminders that the festival is organized by the Cascadia Poetics Lab and sponsored by Poetics and Writers, La Sela, For Culture, We Staff, Seattle Escribe, Humanities Washington, Sumu Greater Seattle, National Endowment of the Arts, Kubota Garden, and Depot Press, Office of the Arts and Culture Seattle, and Washington State Arts Commission. And a very special thank you to the Spring Street Center for sponsoring and hosting this event. So we want to definitely say that. And I have a note and a word to remind everyone. Sally Hedges Blanquez says, make sure to remember to get your Poetry Postcard Festival bundles, because that's the gateway drug. So, there you go. That's how you get started. And we also have joining us Skylar, who's joined us all the way from Kansas. Skylar, would you mind standing and sharing a brief experience with us? Poetry postcards.
Talk about postcards.
Postcards.
Yeah.
Postcards are amazing. This time I leaned into the idea of spontaneous composition, since we've been studying that for 3 years with Bob, who I met for the first time in person today, after only seeing him as his better in person. And my classmates, Carl and Andrew. So this time for the postcards, I leaned into spontaneous composition. I happen to have a collection of Alphonse Moucha illustrations, and I found that I could sort of meditate on the illustration, flip it over, write something, and take it on its way. It was a delightful experience. Altogether delightful. And I'm so happy to be here, and thank you.
Thank you, Skylar. Next up, we have a very lively discussion, but we'd like to reintroduce our very own, Dr. Cate Gable.
I'm on the, I started out, I first knew Sam in 1980. I've been going through some old papers and I found a letter that he wrote me about my poetry, which was such a treasure. Anyway, I was on this Seattle, the SPLAB board, then we moved it to the Cascadia, and I'm on Watershed Press. And this morning we've got a fantastic panel for you here. I'm going to read just a very short excerpt from one of Andrew's books, Tracks Along the Left Coast. It's a biography of Jaime D'Angulo. Is that how you say his name?
Many ways to say it, but D'Angulo.
D'Angulo. It's a little dialogue between Oriole Girl and Fox Boy, and she's giving him a hard time. She says, "You study too much. It will hurt your back." Why do you ask all those questions from the grown-ups? They don't know the answers. They only embarrass themselves. But I want to know the truth, he says. What for? Because I want to know the way it really happened. It happened the way they tell it. But they tell it differently. Then that's because it happened differently. Andrew Schelling, the author of that and many other books, is a poet, essayist, author, translator, ecologist, naturalist, and explorer of wilderness areas. He grew up in the townships of New England, west of Boston, and his early influences were the wildlands of New England and Asian art, even in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts and Harvard's Fogg Museum. He moved to North California and graduated from the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he studied poetry with Norman O. Brown and history with Gregory Bateson. I want to talk about that at some point. He then pursued Sanskrit and Asian literature at the University of California, Berkeley, collaborated with poets and practitioners and ecologists. In 1990, he moved to the Southern Rocky Mountains, living in and around Boulder, Colorado, joined the faculty of Naropa, where he teaches poetry, Sanskrit, and wilderness writing. Among his 25 published titles are 17 books of poetry, anthologies, essays, and translations. He's one of the very few renowned literary translators of ancient and medieval India, including Dropping the Bow, Poems of Ancient India, which received the Academy of American Poets Translation Award. And he's written, as I mentioned, this biography. All of our panelists up here have miles of publications, so forgive me if I don't mention all of them. Tim McNulty is seated next to Andrew, and if you were here last night, you know that he's a naturalist and also a brilliant poet. What struck me most about his poetry is the sensitivity in his interaction with the natural world, the exquisite detail that he captures, and the blending of his scientific knowledge with his love of creatures and the landscape around him. His poetry is spectacular. He lives on the Olympic Peninsula, and as he said once before, once he got there, he hasn't moved, and it shows in the authenticity of his voice. His newest book is Salmon, Cedar, Rock, and Rain, and published by Braided Word. Gary was also instrumental in the effort of removing the Elwha dams, which I'm going to ask him about today. Holly Hughes, next to him, also has a checkered career, I think I could say. She's been a journalist, a skipper of a 65-foot schooner, a teacher. She co-directed the Convergence Writers Series and co-founded the Sustainability Council. She's a graduate of Pacific Lutheran University, the Rainier Writing Program, and served on the staff there for 13 years. She taught writing at Edmonds Community College for more than 2 decades. Her books include Sailing by Ravens, and she co-authored The Pen and the Bell, Mindful Writing in a Busy World, and was the editor of an award-winning anthology, Beyond Forgetting, Poetry and Prose about Alzheimer's disease. Her most recent book is Hold Fast. We have copies here. She lives on the Olympic Peninsula, and she divides her time between Shimkin Valley and a log cabin in Indianola. Mike Daley there, squeezed into the corner, the founding editor of Empty Bowl. I know many of you know him. He was former poet-resident for the Washington State Arts Commission, Skagit River Poetry Foundation, Massachusetts Cultural Council, He retired from teaching at Mount Vernon High School in 2012. His reviews and essays have appeared in Pacific Northwest Review of Books, Ray and Chronicles, Port Townsend Leader, Bookmark Quarterly Review, and his collections of poetry include The Straits, To Curve, Moonlight in the Redemptive Forest, Of a Feather, and Born With. He's been awarded by the Washington State Arts Commission, Seattle Arts Commission, Artist Trust, a Fulbright, and the National Endowment of the Humanities. Pleasure Boat Studio has also published his essays Way Out There and his translation of Altia Mundus, an Italian writer, Lucia Gazzina. So we've got a powerhouse up here today. And I'd like to ask Andrew to start us off by giving us some background on the concept of empty bowl. That's the theme of our discussion today. And perhaps even as it might be represented by his biography of the Jack of all trades, Buckaroo Bohemian linguist, Jaime D'Angulo.
Yes, a couple people have asked me how to pronounce the name, and you hear it pronounced variously, but there is a letter that Jaime D'Angulo wrote to Ezra Pound in which he said, "My name is pronounced An as in Analects, Goo as in Goo eyes, and Low as in lowbrow." D'Angulo. Well, one of the joys of, living in a place like Tim was talking about last night is that you can live somewhere, but you can also travel, and I get to meet these various folk here. Tim, I've spent a little bit of time with. Holly, I've never met before, and Michael Daley I met about 6 years ago when I was going around giving greetings from that book, Tracks Along the Left Coast, and Michael welcomed us in, sat us down, offered us tea, and the first thing he said to me was, "I've never been a footnote before." So the tough news is all of you will be something of a footnote for what I want to say today. But when Paul Nelson asked me to sit on this panel on Empty Bowl and Empty Bowl Press, of course, which comes out of that concept, I said, well, I'm not sure what I would have to offer except at the time Empty Bowl was founded and the real surge in biological thinking began to happen and sort of a consciousness was developing. It became a literary consciousness. I was living in what's really the bioregion south of here, which would be Shasta bioregion. And I think some of the thinking about bioregional ways of living, let's say lifestyles that include resources and, not just material resources, but also spiritual resources, intellectual resources, all of that, really got articulated well in Shasta bioregion, but about the same time that things were developing up here. So I want to sort of look at some of the things that were happening in 1976. I may get a few dates off by a year or two, but that's okay. Michael Daley founded Dalmont Journal in 1976, and that seems to be about the date that Empty Bowl Press was also founded. 1976, so think of that as a watershed moment. There is certainly a good deal of exchange at that time between Cascadia and the Shasta bioregion just south. So a couple of real good points of reference would be Planet Drum Foundation, founded in 1973 by a character named Peter Berg, who had been in the San Francisco Mime Troupe in San Francisco and took his experience with mime theater into a kind of bioregional expression around Northern California. And the Planet Drum Foundation did a little bit of publishing, a lot of, I think you could say, education or propaganda on bioregional thinking. You've got this gorgeous map here of Cascadia, but the early bioregion map that I remember was one of Shasta bioregion, which was collaborated on by the Bolinas artist Arthur Okamura and another guy who lived in Bolinas named Dennis Breedlove, who was a great plant biologist or botanist. Dennis Breedlove specialized in bromeliads, which is a sort of, well, it's not as complicated as nematodes, let's say, but it's, particularly he worked down in Chiapas. To give you an idea of how far bioregional thinking has come, Breedlove, as an early bioregionalist, thought, wouldn't it be great if I had brought a bunch of pine trees from Oaxaca up to Bolinas, and did, and ended up completely pissing off his neighbors, Joanne Kiger and Donald Gurovich, because once those Oaxaca pines had established themselves, no native plants or even animals wanted to enter the grove. So, for a plant biologist identified as a bioregionalist who is, late as the 1970s, not recognize what we now take as, very standard understanding about the need for native plants, native animals, that sort of thing. Shasta bioregion, if you drive south from Cascadia, it may not be easy to define the precise line where you cross into Shasta, but at some point you've entered a different zone of some sort. Definition of it would be the Shasta bioregion is bounded by the Pacific Ocean to the west, the Sierra Nevada. There's a lot of dispute of whether it's the whole Sierra Nevada or along the ridge line, but it's, that's approximate. Something like the Klamath Siskiyous in the north, and I think there's a little bit of California politics that gets mixed into this. Some people want to draw the line sort of at the base of San Francisco Bay, maybe somewhere down around Watsonville or something. But in fact, other people say, no, really, we go all the way to the south of the Tehachapi's. The Tehachapi Mountains are transverse mountains that go across California, north of LA, and really divide what you could say is the San Joaquin Valley from the Mojave Desert. So there's a really clear boundary there that could be seen as bioregional. So the Planet Drum Foundation, but there were other things going on. In 1972 and 1973, great plant wizard, scholar of plant allies, alchemist, mystic, gadabout named Dale Pendle, who many of you know, I think, founded a journal called Kioi. Kioi, he says, was originally conceived as a local magazine, the Sinkyoko Basin, and Kioi is named for a creator spirit on Sinkyone tribal grounds, which is around Gerberville where Dale was living. Sinkyone, by the way, is an Athabascan language, and it's the drainage of the South Fork of the Eel River. 9 of 10 writers Dale published were from Sinkyone tribal grounds. By issue 2, though, the following year, he had included poets who lived in the drainages of the Eel, the Yuba, the Trinity, the Russian and Mad rivers, and tribal areas that were originally Wyatt, Chimariko, Yurok, Pomo, Maidu, and Chumash. Shortly after that, Dale moved up to the San Juan Ridge in the foothills of Sierra Nevada and joined the community that had been, sort of founded by Gary Snyder and Richard Baker and even Allen Ginsberg and former Governor Jerry Brown had been in the mix there. Once he had extended his territory, Dale decided to rename the magazine Kuksu. Kuksu was a figure more general to Central and Northern California native cultures, a kind of creator figure, very mysterious. And I think Dale largely learned about Kuksu from the writings of Jaime Dangulo, who was really dramatizes some of that. The community up there also included Peter Bluecloud, Susan Suntree, and I think that first issue of Kuksu in 1974 gave what I think of as the first really well-articulated approach to bioregion publication. So this is Dale's words. Kuksu, formerly Kioi, works with regional emphases. While we concentrate on rural Northern California, we try to include representatives of associated areas across the continent and around the world. Glancing back over past issues, perhaps what we mean by representatives of associated areas are individuals who, by evidence of their writing, would feel themselves to be, if not at home, at least comfortable guests in the Northern California backcountry. We feel that the geographical space delineated by the occurrence of Kuksu cults in the early 20th century and before forms still a resonant cultural aggregate. That's a good term. Resonant cultural aggregate sharing rivers, climate, flora and fauna, patterns of speech, pioneering history, ecological problems, contemporary social and political initiations, and Aboriginal mythology. It is from the latter category, the Aboriginal mythology, that comes the unifying culture bearer, Kuksu, our namesake. Quick footnote to that is that Dale and Peter Bluecloud used to have knockout arguments over the appropriateness of Dale appropriating the term Kuksu. So that was a little footnote, and again, showing how consciousness has moved forward. About the same time, well, let's say, 1974, that issue, he included as co-editors Gary Snyder and Steve Sanfield. And of course, one of the touchstones or real landmarks for bioregional thinking at that time was Gary Snyder's book, Turtle Island, which came out in 1974 and gave a very well-defined both bioregional take, but also, included the politics of bioregions. Around the same time, a little publisher in the Bay Area, run by Fred Bunke, Shaman Drum, published Snyder's The Fudo Trilogy, printed by Clifford Burke at Cranium Press. And it included, besides Snyder's well-known Smokey the Bear Sutra, a piece called California Water Plan Poem. And this comes directly out of the watershed thinking of those days. I think I'll back up just to 1971 when Turtle Island Press was founded. Of course, Gary didn't name his book after the press, but it was part of the consciousness at that time, rethinking an approach to North America as Turtle Island. And Bob and Eileen Callahan, who ran Turtle Island Press, widened scope, what maybe a bioregion would be, or some sort of association of bioregions to the North American continent. And I think some of the things that Bob and Eileen did is they retrieved writers whose work had been neglected because they were maybe a little bit ahead of their time. And I would mention three really important ones. One was the great geographer Carl Ortman Sauer, who was republished in a number of volumes by the Callahans and really gave a good view of migration patterns in and to the so-called New World Turtle Island. I think for many of us, gave us a real scientific and geographical underpinning to an understanding what the continent was and what its people were and what its resources were. The second writer I want to mention that Bob Callahan excavated was Zora Neale Hurston, who, aside from her novels, had been a student of Franz Boas at Columbia University and did really first-rate anthropological work. So they republished Tell My Horse, her big volume on voodoo, and also Mules and Men, her account of African-American folklore, another great book called The Sanctified Church, in which she looked at preachers in the sanctified church as really, oral poets. And then, of course, the third figure that they brought out was a guy with an underground reputation as a real sort of coyote figure and a great writer and also a great storyteller, thanks to having done about 100 broadcasts the first year. Pacific Radio began, KPFA Radio. This was Jaime Dangulo. And so these three figures brought up by Turtle Island Press. And I'll mention one other person who I think some of you may know, a guy named Malcolm Margolin, who had started out as a Jewish boy in Boston, escaped the little claustrophobic neighborhood that he lived in Boston with his girlfriend, drove across the country in a VW bus, and landed in the East Bay. And Malcolm got a job with the East Bay Regional Parks and really set about learning everything he could about the natural history, the cycles of weather, the migration patterns that had to do with particularly the wilder lands in the East Bay. And then 1 year the Park Service decided that rangers ought to wear uniforms. And Malcolm said, take your uniforms and I can tell you where to stick them. This is the militarization of the natural world. I want nothing to do with that. So he was without a job, and he thought, well, the one thing I do know is a lot about the natural history here. So he wrote a wonderful early book called East Bay Out, an unauthorized guide to hiking, camping, swimming, and fishing in the East Bay regional parks. And he describes it as more poetic than practical. The book was a song of praise for the beauty of the land and the abundance of life it supported. And of course, once he had written the book, Malcolm needed someplace to publish it. He didn't know any publishers. So he's he's a good hustler. And over the years, he built a thing called Heyday Books, which gets a little bit buried as a bioregional enterprise because most of the publications in those days spoke of California, so it's California Indians or Aboriginal Californians or various aspects of California history. But he certainly had the bioregional eye and was a major voice going on, and all of that. I think, before I leave, I know I'm going over time, but I just want to, one more thing that was really important was way over in Marin County, Co-Evolution Quarterly, run by Stuart Brand with a bunch of other characters. They did an issue, winter 1981, called, on a bioregional issue, and they very importantly published what I think is the great manifesto of bioregionalism, Where Are You At? A bioregional quiz. And there were 20 questions here, and they're very obvious ones to most of us now. Number one, trace the water you drink from precipitation to tap. Where's your water come from? How many days till the moon is full? It'll add 2 days slack if you answer that. What soil series are you standing on? What was the total rainfall in your area last year?
Too much.
Where was the last time a fire burned in your area? We're all having to really pay attention to get these answers right this time. What was the primary subsistence technique of the culture that lived in your area before you? Name 5 edible, et cetera, through 20. But what really got me about it was the scoring. If you add up your correct answers, 0 to 3, you have your head up your ass. 4 to 7, it's hard to be in 2 places at once when you're not anywhere at all. 8 to 12 is a firm grasp of the obvious. 13 to 16, finally you can, you're paying attention. 17 to 19, you know where you're at. And 20, you not only know where you're at, you know where it's at.
Thank you for that great history. I wonder if we can bring some ocean tales into this, Holly. 60-foot schooner, and I know that you've been participating for several years now at the Fisher Poets Gathering in Astoria, which is in my neck of the woods. So tell us a little bit about how your experience, particularly in that arena, fits in or extends, I think, what Andrew has been talking about here. Thank you, Cate, and thank you, Andrew. The journalist in me was writing down everything you said. What a great overview that was. I really appreciate that. And as Cate is suggesting, my early years were not spent rooted anywhere on land. They were spent rooted on the water. I was trying to find a way to be at sea in a way that, and I think it becomes its own, kind of distinct bioregion in a way. But I'd gone up to Alaska to make money for graduate school and ended up falling in love with Alaska and buying with my former husband, buying a fishing boat. And then we fished for 4 years and then ran tenders for 4 years. This was in the late 70s, early 80s. And there were a lot of people like us up in Alaska at that time. It was quite a migration. And I fell in love with Alaska. I ended up not being able to continue fishing for a variety of reasons. But I love the fishing community. One of the things I was reflecting on and thinking about my relationship with Tess Gallagher is that let me back up a minute. Let's see. I was wanting some way to connect with words when I was up there. And one of the things that happened is I took one of Tess's books with me, willingly. And that really changed. I've been an English major. I've been, reading all the English Romantic poets. I thought if you wanted to be a poet, you had to write about the English countryside and clouds. And I loved those poets, but I didn't see a way for me to become that kind of writer. And so finding Tessa's work, writing about growing up in Port Angeles, writing about the place that she lived, that I was now north of, but eventually did come down and settled on the Olympic Peninsula, was a real revelation to me. And I realized that what was missing in my fishing life was more people to talk about books, and that I needed to be a little bit more grounded. So I eventually did leave fishing, but I had lots of sea time, and so what I did with that sea time is I got a license to run boats, and that's how I was able to run this beautiful 65-foot schooner called Crusader. And here's where the worlds kind of converge, because Gary Snyder was one of the board members on Crusader, and really it had a bioregional focus on the water. So we had people like David Brower, Gretel Ehrlich, Gary Snyder, Allen Ginsberg come aboard and sort of share what whatever their passion was with the people on the ship. And so what a gift that was, to be able to spend time with some of these amazing people and be running a boat, which is what I ended up loving about my life up in Alaska, was the time at sea and navigation. I have a book called Sailing by Ravens that really talks about kind of the metaphors of navigation and what rich metaphor kind of potential there is in all that. So I guess that's how I know that's a long circuitous route, but that's kind of how I came to bioregionalism. And it was through the sea, and it was through discovering writers like Tess Gallagher, and then the other writer was Tom Jay, whose wonderful essay, Salmon of the Heart. I had left fishing and I came upon Tom's essay, and it just moved me so deeply that I knew, and Tom actually also taught on Crusader, and so that was, again, the circle coming back around. And through Tom, I met empty bowl writers. And it was with Working the Woods, Working the Sea that I was first published by Empty Bowl. And it's a really wonderful collection. At that point, and my writing was included obviously as Working the Sea, but it was wonderful to meet this whole community of people who were working the land. So I kind of made the transition from sea to land, and I pretty much stayed in Chimacum with little forays to my cabin in Indianola. So stayed on the peninsula. So I hope that answers your question, Cate. Does that, okay? Good. Maybe we can continue with water a little bit. Tim, I wanted you to tell us a little bit more about the amazingness of having the Elwha dams come down
Wow.
and seeing the salmon return much more quickly than I think anybody anticipated.
Yeah, it was and remains a remarkable accomplishment involving many diverse populations on the peninsula and elsewhere, like Washington, D.C. Just back in the late 70s, the owners of both dams, at that time Crown Silverback Company, ran a big mill in Port Angeles and Port Johnson, and needed to relicense the dams. And that gave both the Elwha Clown tribe and environmentalists in the neighborhood the chance to ask some questions. Bruce Brown, at the time a young reporter for the Seattle PI, had done a series of articles about how building the original Elwha Dam was in violation of state rules at the time about destroying salmon runs. All dams should have had passage for salmon at that time. And it really, his book, Mountain in the Clouds, after his PI articles, really kind of educated the public, I think, and galvanized support for, hey, wait a minute, let's maybe see if at the very least we can fix these dams so that salmon can get through, and if that can't happen, let's maybe get rid of them. And so a number of steps that I'll jump over, but the Elwha tribe intervened in the FERC collaboration, or rather the FERC proceedings, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission licensed dams. And a number of environmental organizations, including the one that I worked with, Olympic Park Advocates now, intervened as well. And the company wanted to just keep the dams in place because they were getting a very good deal on power using these antiquated dams. The lower one posed a hazard to the Elwha Tribe Reservation, base of the river. In the 80s, we brought suit against the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission because it turned out there was great legal standing that they could not license a dam in a national park. The second Elwha Dam was in Olympic National Park. And that got their attention, and all of a sudden they were ready to talk. And in 1992, the bill passed Congress. But it wasn't, so that was 92, the Elwha Act. It wasn't until 2011 that the dams came out. So seems fast, kind of slow at the time as the salmon populations were dwindling year by year. But it was just a great communal effort on the part of tribes, resource agencies, the Park Service, conservation activists, sportsmen, fishermen, and some local political representatives. At the time, our congressman was Norm Dix. He was a pretty powerful guy in Washington, D.C., chaired the Appropriations Committee, and had pockets full of money and got on board. And that really got things moving. And then when President Obama was elected, he was looking for some shovel-ready projects to put, I think it was called sequester money. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Those big expenses. And there was the Elwha just waiting for it. And so finally in 2011, the dams were broken. They were both gone by 2014. And after that, it was just a progression of the salmon beginning to return year by year. That was an exquisite experience for all of us. It continues to happen. The salmon are moving up past the lower dam site, past the upper dam site, up into the upper watershed, bull trout as far as the headwaters of the Elwha Basin. Chinook salmon. It continues to be one of the great celebrations of hope and community action for those of us on the peninsula and nationwide. Really, the Klamath River dams down in Northern California are beginning to come out now. So the Elwha is reverberating throughout the ecosystem. We hope it will eventually have an impact on the dams on the Snake River coming up. So,
Salmon are near and dear to my heart. My family has a cabin on the Natchez River on Chinook Pass Highway, and when I was a kid in the 50s, we had salmon that came up there, went up to Little Natchez, and of course, when the dam started being built, that all stopped. And I remember being, I was an environmental consultant with an organization in the Bay Area called the Future 500 for a while. And at one point, in a gathering of commercial folks, people were talking about, well, how will we know when we get there on sustainability goals? And I said, when the salmon come back. So, Michael, I'd like you to talk too, of course, about the press and how your mission relates to the human communities and wild places. And then we'll try to tie these threads together. We'll take some questions from the audience too.
I didn't really prepare much. I sort of thought I was the statue at the end of the table we were going to. He did that. Early on, in 1976, quite a few of us were tree planters, reforesters, and many of us, in fact, even at this table, were refugees from New England. And when we got out to clear cuts to plant trees, we were, many of us, poets who had a serious education in literature and in poetry. We read a lot of the same poets. Well, of course, Gary Snyder, but Robert Sund also, and has studied literature. So here we were out on these clear-cut slopes, right? And one of my favorite memories is being on a ridge, someplace, I don't know, maybe outside Forks we were, something like that, and acres and acres of what was known as, to us, industrial waste. Dead trees, slashed all over, on both sides of this ridge, and we were working with a couple of guys who had just kind of started our crew, and when you're planting, you come together at a certain point, and we're all standing around, and this one guy says, "Where'd you go to graduate school?" So as we moved through our seasons, and we kept smoking dope, and got this crazy idea that we could do a poetry publication. And Tim has the first copy. Do you want to show that?
yeah, number one, letterpress, hand-printed, beautiful, Michael and Bob Blair.
I lived in a tent for one season with this guy, Bob Blair, who had a letterpress, and we talked a lot about doing just a little collection of poetry, and what would that entail, and then could we do that every year or so. And so when we got back and we had our off-season time, we started doing letterpress, and Bob was very good at letterpress. I was, of course, an idiot. I didn't know much at all, and then that was the only letterpress work I ever did, because it was just a little too precise for me. And at one point also, I asked Bob, "What's the name of this press?" And he said, "Empty Bowl." And that's really all it was. All it was. It had no special meaning, For a long time, I published books by Bill Porter in the last few years, and he had a publicist who called me frequently to figure out how we're going to promote those books. And I said, I have other books that we're publishing. This isn't a Buddhist press. Really? And so, yeah, I mean, it's a literary press. The next book was also a Delma, and actually I wanted Andrew to explain a little bit about the origin of that. Do you know much about that?
Yeah, I can say something.
Okay. It's from a song collected by Hamid Abdullah, But the second issue was an offset press, and I edited it, and I had instruction how to get money from the state by our friend Sam Hamill, who helped a great deal with that. Around the time, early 80s, a group of us now, of tree planters and the sculptor at that time, Tom Jay, and a wonderful influence, a man named Jerry Worsman, who was, when I first met him, was a partner with Freeman House. You could hold up Freeman's
Yes,
book.
Freeman's book. This is
Forthcoming is,
forthcoming. Yeah. So a watershed runs through you. It collects the works of Freeman House since everything that was written either both before and after Totem Salmon. So you may be familiar with Totem Salmon lessons from life lessons. I'm trying to forget, I'm forgetting the title of it.
watershed runs
No, the life lessons from another species was Totem Salmon. Yeah. So we're really thrilled to be publishing this, and he passed away. Jerry Martin was the person who gathered, working with Freeman's daughter Laurel, who gathered all the writing together. So, thank you.
So Freeman's close friend, Jerry, I guess is another tall story, tall tale. I'll go back to when we were tree planters. I hurt my back. I bent down and couldn't straighten up. And eventually, I was on Labor and Industries, L&I. I was supported for a while. And after a few months, they said, you know, you've really got to get a job now, the state did. What do you do? I write. Oh, we could get you a job writing. I said, yeah, sure you could. Yeah, okay, sure. What do you want me to do? Well, and then they sent me around to a bunch of newspapers in the Northwest, and I applied. And they had some kind of a deal with the newspaper where they would pay part of the money, and then after 6 months, you know, they wouldn't be paying that money. And so, of course, the editor said, fuck, no, we're not going to hire this guy. So eventually, after 5 or 6 of these attempts, I said, you know, I know a small press called Empty Bowl, and they're wonderful people. Do you think maybe they could hire me? Sure, they have a business license. So I went to Jerry Gorson, and said, Jerry, we need a business license. How do we do that? How do we go and get incorporated? No problem. Jerry was this remarkable person who could do just about anything. He was a great naturalist. He was also a wonderful writer and editor. He happened coincidentally to be the grandson of Max Perkins. And he was, you know, kind of a genius in many ways. And I'd like to close out by reading a poem that I wrote after Jerry died. It brings in our whole issue of tree planting. There were a bunch of us in the crew. While we were tree planting, of course, we were always talking poetry, and sometimes often reading poetry to one another. This is called Finding My Guides to Calypso Bulbosa for Jeremiah Gorsling. I was as if snatched up in an owl's memory when they spoke of the wild orchid and dropped in a high meadow. Back to the day the crew circled as Jerry, down on one knee, Calypso's droopy bell leaning on his fingertip, extolled the sexed delicacy of its incarnadine organs, thin as the veil draped off the shoulder of a divinity's concubine. More than his usual red-headed fairness, his face glowed, and unmindful of us, he blushed like a man in love. As the rest of us, our gear on the trail up a rock-faced mud slope to scramble thousands of fir seedlings down into torched slash, awaited while he effused on her orchid rarity, her year-in, year-out eternity, undetected, constant as a church bell, evanescence then and there under his lightest touch. We all stood around, heavy-booted, with the hope just once, if ever, to feel aroused such reverence for this fairy slipper orchid with its solitary, nodding, and strikingly beautiful flower.
Oh, okay, yeah, the Dalmokma is a term, I don't know where you got it from, but it was Jaime d'Angulo. It was, yeah, stolen from Jaime d'Angulo. So looking south to the Shasta Valley region, Dalmoma is an Achumawi place name. Achumawi are the Pit River Indians, and Dalmokma was an old village along the Pit River, somewhere near Alturas in present-day California. And three places you could have gotten that name would have been either Jaime d'Angulo's 1950 broadcasts on KPFA radio, in which he read what he called old-time stories. The book was, the radio broadcasts were eventually compressed into a very expurgated book called The Indian Tales, which is still wonderful. It's been printed since 1953. It includes a number of shaman songs of Coyote Old Man, and one of them has named Dalmokma in it. It goes, at Dalmokma in the spring, I dig wild radishes. At Dalmoma, I find only rotten ones. And that's a medicine song. And in the book Indian Tales, it's sung by Loon Woman, who is probably modeled on a woman Jaime d'Angulo knew named Old Cate, who was actually a Modoc and lived up sort of in Klamath country in Oregon. But a lot of these songs, and this is part of d'Angulo's study, were passed around Northern California. This whole sort of Sioux region exchanged a lot of songs, and they often, sort of jumped their boundaries in funny ways. So a song in a language you didn't understand might become a medicine song. It might have been a hunting song, or a ranching song, or a farming song, or something like that. But Dalmokma, and Dalmo with an apostrophe, which stands for a glottal stop, and ma, so ma. Glottal stop is, not much used in our English language, but you get it in uh-oh, or the way the British sometimes pronounce little. That's a glottal stop. And of course, there's the great linguist joke. Excuse me, Professor, I don't even know what a glottal stop is.
Lots of glottal stops in Hawaiian, too. We were talking at dinner a couple nights ago about what I think is a necessity for a consciousness change to start with grief in terms of where we are, our eco-region here. And I just wanted to ask the question, maybe all of you could weigh in on this. It seems to me that poetry could be part of servicing that, but also giving us the companion of hope for that in terms of how we go forward from this difficult time we're in. Whoever wants to jump in.
I'll take a run. I guess kind of building on what Tim talked about with the dams coming down, the Elmwood Dam coming down, the Klamath coming down, and the efforts underway now to breach the dams on the lower Snake River. One of the projects that we did this year was a project around salmon called I Sing the Salmon Home, which was edited by our former Washington State Poet Laureate Rena Priest. Some of the contributors are here in the room. And it was a really, speaking of hope, for me it was a really heartening project because what Rena asked, Rena was able to get a grant from the Academy of American Poets, and in her role as Poet Laureate, she was traveling all around the state and asking people to write about their relationship with salmon And so what we ended up with is just this beautiful collection of people honoring salmon, each in their own way through relationship, right? And the relationships are all different. There's commercial fishers, there's sports fishers, there's people who love to eat salmon, there are biologists, and many of them, of course, are poems of witness, talking about where we are with the dwindling salmon runs and what we need to do to restore them. And so I guess in terms of hope, this comes back to the bioregion, and I think this is where, for me, the salmon bring the sea to land, right? They bring the nutrients back to the trees. I think Tom J. has a beautiful image of the silver needle stitching the two together, the sea and the land. And for me, that's where the hope is these days. And I guess I think you're right, Cate. I think poetry allows us to grieve, and through the process of grieving, we're able to move to the next place, which is one of engaged work, doing whatever we can in our own community, in our own bioregion. But I do think we have to acknowledge where we are, right? And to grieve before we can do that. And that's why I'm really happy to be involved in this work, because I feel like it's a very small thing to be able to do, but just to be able to encourage people to take that step. The other night we gave a reading with the Cascadia Field Guide. I don't know if you're familiar with that beautiful book, but that's, to me, a really revolutionary book. And one of the things we did, because Rena wasn't able to come join the reading, is I made copies of the poems, passed them out, and then everybody present in the room read them aloud, and including a first grader, because one of the submissions came from a first grader. So I just think that kind of community building and not using isn't the right word, honoring the salmon, that's something that we can do, that's still within our power to make that change.
Thanks, Holly. And I have to agree with everything Holly said. I have always felt also the perhaps limited power of poetry to reach larger numbers of people, given the severity of the crisis we're facing and have been facing for many, many years. I've paired my poetry work with natural history work as well as conservation environmental activism. So it's, I think, as Holly mentioned, poetry expresses the healing quality. It really does. It expresses our utmost visions, our grieving, our insights. It's where we can share our hearts in the most sincere way. I think for me that natural history writing reaches larger numbers of people and maybe can do a little bit of missionary work. At its best, poets can bring that sensibility of poetic language and evocative language into prose writing, and I think that helps a lot. The environmental work is just nuts and bolts, politics, political organizing. I spend way too much time spinning my wheels and getting nowhere on that, but every now and then, something like the LWA comes along, something like adding Shai Beach to Olympic National Park, creating wilderness areas in the Eastern Olympics. We have a bill now that's passed in the House of Congress several times, the Wild Olympics, Wilderness and Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, that will add an additional 126,000 acres of wilderness and Olympic National Forest, designate 19 wild and scenic rivers in the Olympics, help protect that core of the ecosystem where many beings, salmon, wildlife, older forests take refuge. It's been an incredibly long haul. I don't know if we'll be seeing passage for that in the next couple of years, but those little victories just keep us all hanging on and keep us moving forward. I would say for myself personally and for a lot of us, poetry is the basis of motivation for the other stuff.
Kate, you asked earlier about the theme of Empty Bowl, the human communities and wild places. And early on, we had a theme that had first publication, literature and responsibility. And when I think about that, is there an unresponsible literature? Is all literature is responsible, right? Even if that's not acknowledged. But the other part of the present Empty Bowl theme, human communities in wild places, is obviously hopeful that something can come about. This is a publication of the Madrona Project, whose theme was that, human communities in wild places. And if you can look later, you might see this beautiful artwork. It's by the sculptor and artist Tony Angel. There's a picture of an owl. It's called Captive. Looks like maybe a Douglas squirrel. The Douglas squirrel is wild places. The owl is civilization, human communities. That's what I thought when I put it on the cover. It's pretty devastating to think that the what we call the natural world, nature, quote unquote nature, wilderness, it's reality, right? I mean, it's constantly coming back. You can drive down I-5 and people are mowing the grass like crazy in the median. But a couple of years ago I saw a few coyotes there. It's the wild world is there despite our eternal war with it, and we're never going to win. and that's hopeful. I think it's very hopeful.
I'm just thinking now, since you were asking about grief, a couple of nights ago, a few of us were sitting at dinner and having an interesting conversation about grief, and we, really began with, observation of how much anger there is out there in our world, anger and fear, and we talked, very psychologically about these are really cover-ups for grief. But I think, being conscious of that is really helpful, and then being able to turn back and channel both the anger and the fear at times is really the work that all of you are doing and some of what, poetry does. I often, I love to think about classical Tamil poetry, Tamil South India, several thousand years ago, and they had two kind of genres of poetry. One was love poetry, which seems to be what we'd all like poetry to be, and then there's war poetry. And war poetry is a careful channeling, I think, of that anger, fear that comes out of the grief. And that may be sort of the place where we are now, where, love and war is what we need to go back to as eco-people, as bioregionalists, as activists, and I agree with you, Tim, a lot of it's, war is not like lots of explosions and then everybody goes home. It's like lots of boredom, lots of really hard work, it's time in the trenches. And, as I teach in college, I'm often telling my students, take yourselves seriously as writers. Don't just write poetry, like Tim said. I'm not sure that's going to be adequate, but write letters to the editors of your newspapers, write to your senators, educate yourself about what's going on locally, and use your skills, a person who knows something about language and words, and, contact people, persuade people, go to war, in a sense, and stay in love, too.
Are there any audience members listeners who would like to ask a question, yeah, come on up to the mic here, or maybe we can hear you. Give it a try.
Okay, thank you. That was beautiful. Thanks, everybody. I was thinking to build upon what some of you were saying. First of all, what you were saying about the owl, not the pussycat, but the squirrel, reminded me a lot of Brenda's poetry. Brenda Pullman, the owl, I don't know if you would say, is a figure of civilizational thinking, and the squirrel of the wild, but anyway. My question has to do with grief. I also teach a course on art and activism, and we brought Reverend Billy to UC Santa Cruz, who talked a lot about the necessity, and of course he's very performative, and which irritates some people, but the necessity of blowing through the papered over kind of construction of late capitalist coverings of our grief from places like Chase and others. He was talking about the beautiful connected feelings during Occupy. That his strategy was storytelling. So he asked everyone in the audience to tell a story from childhood about a place that they had lost. And so people started opening up. I remember in San Jose when it used to be orchard country, and we would walk through these, and people started, crying, anthropology professors and so forth. And I'm wondering if there is kind of a space where poetry can meet natural history, can meet consciousness-raising feminist second-wave groups or romantic poets who felt that, poetry raised consciousness during the democratic revolutions of the French and American, time in the late 1700s. And if that can be the basis of what Andrew says is a kind of warrior consciousness. I mean, we woke up to a declaration of war by Netanyahu today. That's not the right kind of war. But what is the right kind of war, and what does it have to do with grief? I'm sorry to go at length about what you moved through so much. So
That's a great question, which I am not going to try to summarize.
Did you say you're from Santa Cruz? You're from Santa Cruz? Yeah. I lived there at one point. I went to school there, actually. And
I taught, I remember you came.
Yeah. There was a founder of UC Santa Cruz named Page Smith.
Oh.
You've probably heard of him. And Page Smith, when he left the university out of sort of uncertainty or maybe even despair that universities were doing their job anymore, he began to hold what he called the Penny University down there. Remember the Cafe Pergolesi?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, before the earthquake, it was back behind the bookstore. And Page Smith had the Penny University there. And one of the things he did was he took off from a William James essay that is called Moral Equivalent of War. And it really tried to channel those warlike energies towards socially active, civilly responsible work. And, that I think is one way to think of it is, can you keep that warlike energy, but, it's the moral equivalent of war. So, we have other kinds of war too, really, really tragically. But yeah, I think that could be a touchstone for us as activists in North America, as well as, so many good writings since then, especially, in the 60s and 70s, people who thought really hard about what war meant and what you were willing to give up to stand apart from it. So, we lost Daniel Ellsberg this last year. There was a guy who went to war to stop a war and was willing to sacrifice himself. And, we have plenty of Earth First people, really like brave youngsters. I'm too old to do that anymore, but the youngsters, I love it when I see that energy, that they're willing to put themselves on the line, the whole, Occupy movement.
Anybody else want to respond? Any other questions? Yes.
So I'm new to the literature of bioregionalism, but I was thrilled to look at that map of Cascadia and see that the bathymetry of the ocean offshore had been included. I've spent some time on oceanographic research vessels above that seabed, and so I'm wondering who is writing about bioregionalism and the ocean's role. Because really, the Pacific Ocean is a life support system for this land-based region that we love. So I'm looking for insights.
Go ahead.
I don't have someone coming to mind, a writer that focuses on the ocean per se as a it's bioregional, the feeding effect on land, nourishing effect on land. I should be able to help with someone. How are you?
I have a couple. Sylvia Earle is somebody who comes to mind just because she's been doing this for so long and writes so beautifully about it. I mean, to me, she goes, she's kind of in the tradition of Rachel Carson, and we've needed more voices like that writing for the ocean, because I think it's not, even as we're, addressing the consequences of climate change on the ocean, it's a lot of it is just new research happening. But I can recommend a book of fiction that I think does a really beautiful job of talking about ocean acidification in a fictional way, and it's by Nancy Lord, who's an Alaskan writer. She lives in Homer, came out about 2 years ago, and it takes place on a research vessel, and they're college students, and it's a really engaging story, and she teaches us a lot about, ocean acidification and what's happening with it. I can't resist this opportunity to put in a little plug for another Empty Bowl book, so if you'll forgive me. Another writer that we just published who's writing about the sea is, she's a Southeast Alaska troller. Her name is Tella Adson, and the title of the book, it's a collection of essays called What Water Holds. And Tella is not writing as a biologist or an oceanographer, but she's writing as somebody who's spent her whole life, she grew up on a fishing boat, she's been fishing for 40 years. She's an incredible observer of life at sea, of just the smallest details. Beautiful, beautiful writer. And, Cate, I realize I didn't really answer your question about Fisher Poets, but I've been going to Fisher Poets from the very first year, more than 23 years now. And for me, it was a way to stay connected with the community that I left, basically. But I still really value those friendships. And one of those friendships was with the founder, John Broderick. One of the early years at Fisher Poets, I heard Tella read some of the essays, one of the essays that was in this book, and I was just blown away by her writing. And so when we took the helm of Empty Bowl, I really wanted to make sure to help get her work out into the world, and it was just published last spring. It doesn't go completely to what you're asking, but it gives a really beautiful view of life on the water, and not just of fishing, but of gender roles and social justice. And she's a very deep thinker, wide-ranging, and I think spending time at sea, you can't help but be that way. At least that was my experience, is that it's this kind of vast collective unconscious that you're floating on, and it makes its way into your writing. So, again, that doesn't directly address your question, but I hope there are people who are writing more about the sea, because I think it's really important right now. Any other questions? Yes?
Not a question, just a recommendation. On Time and Water. Icelandic author, and I'm sorry I don't remember his name, and it mainly deals with the disappearance of the glaciers, but by extension is also speaking about the acidification of the oceans.
Can you
Beautifully written book.
Is it On Time and Water?
On Time
and Water.
Okay, great.
Beautiful book. I read it twice now, and I'm buying copies to give away, so that's...
I'll take one.
Okay, send me your address. I will mail it to you.
Jan, you've got a question. Maybe we'll let you have the last say here.
Oh, I don't want the last say. I just wanted to speak a little bit about that part of Cascadia that is between Seattle and Alaska.
Yes.
If somebody could point out Georgia Strait and the Discovery Islands, So between Vancouver Island and the mainland. Okay, that's Georges Strait, and north of there is the Discovery Islands.
Okay.
So I have a salmon story about that, which was reported in a publication everyone should know about coming out of Vancouver called Watershed Sentinel. They used to publish more literary work than they're doing now. It's mostly journalism now, but they always list U.S. rates on the back, so I'm sure there are folks here who know about it. A recent article in the Watershed Sentinel was written by Alexandra Morton, one of our crusading marine biologists, and the report was that there's been a historic return of pink salmon in the watersheds along that area, and she attributes this directly to the removal of the salmon farms. We have salmon farms we had salmon farms in the Strait, and she campaigned incredibly hard and got rid of them. And now 2 years later, the pinks are coming back. Life's free, it's amazing. And there's talk about reinstituting the salmon farms.
Reinstituting what? Sorry.
The salmon farms, bringing them back. More Atlantic salmon in pens with drugs and stuff along there. So you need to know about both parts of that. A press that you might want to pay attention to is Mother Tongue. It'd be 2-3 years ago they published something on Salish Sea, which is an area towards the south end of Vancouver Island, between the Big Island and the mainland. And there's an anthology called Refugium, edited by Yvonne Blomer, Blomer. A lot of work there that also is Cascadia focused, Vancouver Island and Sunshine Coast and that part. I'm sorry I can't tell you more about Haida Gwaii and the coast north there. I'm as ignorant as...
Well, on the subject of hope, I just wanted to mention that fairly recently, largely as a result of Alexander Morton's research, the state of Washington just kicked all the salmon farms out of the Salish Sea here, Puget Sound. Some of them are still there, but there's a timeline, and they're going to be gone, and they're hopefully not going to be coming back. I know it's a serious problem in British Columbia's waters.
So do you folks also, the Salish Sea moves into Puget Sound? And
Puget Sound, yeah. Hood Canal, Puget Sound, Strait of Juan de Fuca, between here and Vancouver Island.
And maybe a reminder when you go to the grocery store to have your money talking too. Buy native salmon. Thank you all, this illustrious crew.